Good morning and welcome. Today I chose to talk about faith. There are three sizes of faith the Bible tells us. Faith is mentioned 507 times in the Old Testament and 304 times in the New Testament. And in Luke chapter 17, verse 6, we read, "The Lord answered that you have the faith even the size as small as a grain of mustard seed. You can say to this mulberry tree, 'May you be uprooted and thrown into the sea,' and it will obey you." The Bible only requires us to have the faith the size of a mustard seed. This seed is half an inch in diameter, but it grows when planted to be 10 to 15 feet high. This plant gives a big yield, and so can your faith. This faith is big enough to perform good works, and even big enough to perform miracles. Jesus said it is big enough, and that should be enough for you and for me. Is your faith this big? The second size faith is wavering faith. It's more than a mustard seed, but it waves with challenges we face every day. It is the kind of faith that grows our faith. As an example of this is St. Peter, the apostle. He was called the rock by Jesus. He was the first pope. He preached to the Jews and was very strong in his faith, but he lacked faith when it came to trials. The best example of this was when he walked on the water, as described in Matthew chapter 14, verses 20 through 31. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples go back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake, while he sent to the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. It was 3:00 in the morning, and Jesus came towards them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified, and in fear they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called him. "Walk. If it's really you, call me to walk to you." And Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water to Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and felt the waves, he got terrified and began to sink. "Save me!" Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed his hand. "You have so little faith," Jesus said, "but why did you doubt me?" Life's challenges can be humbling, even for the strongest. Can you think of a time in your life when your faith got tested and you were found weak in faith? Even when Peter was at his weakest, Peter built his church, and he built it on Jesus. He preaches to the church that are both in Antioch and Rome. Most Christians have this level of faith because we have all grown through life's challenges. We sometimes feel inadequate and don't feel like we measure up to Jesus' ideals at times. And Peter was like this. When he was crucified by Nero for his faith, he insisted on being crucified upside down. This happened on October 30th, 64 AD. Do you have this size faith? One of the greatest stories of faith in the Bible happens to involve a fiery furnace. We find this in Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 28. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up upon the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officials to his officers, his governors, his advisors, his treasurers, his directors, his magistrates, and all the providential officers to come to the dedication of this statue he had set up. So all the officials had come, and they stood up before the statue. And then the herald shouted, "All people of all races and nations and language listens to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the one inside the lair and any other musical instruments, now to the ground fall to worship King Nebuchadnezzar and his own statue. And anyone that refuses will be thrown into a fiery furnace." So at the sound of all the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed down to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to inform on the Jews. He said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the golden statue. When they hear the sound of the horn, or flute, or lyre, or lyre, or harp, or pipes, or any other musical instruments, that decree also states that those that refuse to obey must be thrown into a fiery, blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who you have in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then King Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and said to have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods, to worship my golden statue which I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of any musical instrument. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to Nebuchadnezzar, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, God, who only we serve, is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't really want to make it clear to you, and we want you to know, your majesty, we will never serve your gods or worship the golden statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face even became distorted with the rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than normal. He then ordered the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the fiery furnace. So they tied him up and threw him into the fiery furnace. He was fully dressed. They had on their robes. They had on all their garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, certainly did," they reply. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, and they're unbound, and they're walking around in the fire. And one of them looks like God." Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then I found the officers and the officials and the governors and the advisors all crowded around him. And they saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothes were not scorched, and they didn't even smell of smoke. This is one huge kind of faith, and a faith that is very needed in today's world. And this is a side of faith that we all need. So, is this your side of faith? So now that we have run through these examples, we see what faith in action is. But just what does sin, faith, and justification mean? What are the definitions? Well, sin is the wrong that we do or we do not do. Let's look at faith. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, as a confidence that we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about the things we cannot see, though it were. Through the faith, the people of the days of old earned a good reputation. We understand that the entire universe was formed by God's command, and that what we now see did not come from anything that could have been seen. So, what is faith? Faith means a strong belief in God and His existence. It is having complete confidence in God. It is being a loyal and unshakable in your allegiance to God. It knows that you know that you know that you know. Without seeing, without feeling, without a conviction, you just know He is real, but you don't have the evidence to prove it. Faith is a noun that, like some other words, needs action. Martin Luther believes that faith saves us by our works. No, not by our works, he said, but by a death of Jesus Christ. We find this in Romans chapter 5, verse 9. And it says, we have been made right in His sight by the blood of Christ. He has certainly saved us from God's condemnation. This is why He nailed His thesis to the church and why we have Reformation Day. Justification is God's act of removing the guilt and the penalty of sin by our faith in His Son's death. He declares us justified by our faith. He declares us righteous by His Son's death. And our belief, this is our entrance into heaven. It is not what we do. It is who we know. We believe that this is God's grace, and God's grace is extended to us through this. Today, our lives are full of challenges. We have many fears and uncertainties, and we can only make it through our trials by faith. Our faith today is being tested like the men of old, and we need to review often Hebrews 11, especially verses 4 through 34. They tell us that Abel's faith, that his gift was more acceptable offering to God than Cain's did. And this offering gave evidence that he was a righteous man, and God showed His approval of his gifts. Although Abel is long dead, and he still speaks to us by example of faith. It is by faith Enoch was taken up into heaven without dying. He disappeared before God, and he disappeared. God took him. Before he was taken up, he was known as a person who pleased God. Anyone who wants to come to Him must believe that God exists, and that He is the reward for those who sincerely seek Him. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who had warned him about things that had never happened. By faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when God called him to leave his home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. And he went without anyone knowing where he was going. When he reached the land God promised he would live there by faith, he lived like a foreigner, living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherit the same promise. Abraham was confident, looking forward to the city with the eternal foundations of a city that was designed and built entirely by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promises, and so a rolling nation came from this one man who was as good as dead in age. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the seas and the seashore, there's just no way of counting all his descendants. All these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what God had promised them, but they saw it all from a distance, and they welcomed it. They agreed that they would be foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. They have longed for a country that could come, that they could call their own. If they wanted to have gone back, they certainly could have. But they wanted a better place, a heavenly homeland. It is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promise, was ready to sacrifice his only son, even though God had told him that Isaac, through him, would all his descendants be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God would just bring him back to life again. And in this sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. It was by faith that Isaac promised blessings for the future to his sons, Jacob and Esau. And it was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his own staff. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, confidently said that the people he knew were leaving Egypt, and he actually commanded them to take his body, his bones and his body with them when they left Egypt. What faith? By faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They just knew that God had given him an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression and trouble of God's people, and rather than join the fleeting pleasures of sin he would have had. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of God and Christ than to his own treasures of Egypt, for he was looking forward to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses led the people out of the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorpost of their house so the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right into the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 whole days, and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith that Rahab, a prostitute, was not destroyed with the people and the city that refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. How much more do I need to say? It would be too long to recount the stories of Gideon or Barak or Samson or Jephthah or David or Samuel or all the prophets by the faith. These people overthrew kingdoms. They ruled with justice. They received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the flames of a fire. They escaped death by the edge of a sword. Their weaknesses were turned into strength, and they became strong in battle, and for whole armies to fight. And the women, their loved ones, received them back again, and not from death. Our current events today mean that even admitting that you are a Christian can be life-altering, and in some cases may even bring you to heaven closer than you and sooner than you plan to go. April 26, 1999 was Columbine's High School shooting, where people lost their lives because of their faith. Now we have ISIS to fear. ISIS, somewhere in the world, slaughters a Christian every 5 minutes. Now that means that before I finish this, someone will be asked, "Are you a Christian?" And I hope I will have enough faith to say, "I am." I hope I won't deny Christ like Peter did. But like Peter, Jesus will forgive me, him, and us. But as of today, we struggle with faith. Hear what is said in Ephesians 4:13 and 14. We will continue until we all come to unity in faith and knowledge of God, so that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to full and complete standard of Christ. Then we will no longer be immature children. We won't be tossed and blown about by every wind of new teaching. We will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lives so clever that they sound like the truth. Instead, we will speak the truth in love, going in every way, be more and more like Christ, who was killed for his body, the church. We believe we can enter his rest, for other people saw in my anger that God said that nobody will enter the place of rest if they have not faith. He said that he made the world. We already know that he made this place because he rested on the seventh day. Today, if we're struggling with faith, if this has even tested or touched your heart, let me assure you that God is calling you. He is talking to you. He wants you to make a fresh new commitment, one when you pray and exercise faith and use his strength, his knowledge, his wisdom. Amen and amen.